Good afternoon, everybody. So I think we'll get going. So welcome to this side event, closing the Global Stocktake's Military and Conflict Emissions Gap. I'm Ellie from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and I'm joined today by an incredibly knowledgeable panel on the topic of military and conflict emissions. We'll hear a short presentation from each of our speakers, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience towards the end of the session. So firstly, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Linsey Cottrell, Environmental Policy Officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. She is a chartered environmentalist and has worked in the environmental consultancy sector for 25 years before joining CEOBS. Linsey is an experienced environmental practitioner, and in her role at CEOBS, she works on military greenhouse gas emissions and supporting the integration of environmental protection in humanitarian disarmament programs. She's going to talk us through the status of military emissions reporting within the UNFCCC at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you for the introduction, and also firstly thank you everyone for joining us here today for this very important side event, which is looking at pretty much an overlooked aspect of climate change, our militaries. I'll give you a brief introduction on military reporting to the UNFCCC and its wider status, highlighting the gaps and the issues relating to this lack of information. So a very brief introduction to my organisation, the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS. We are a UK charity working to increase the protection and people and ecosystems from the impact of armed conflict and military activities. In 2021, we joined colleagues from the University of Durham and the University of Lancaster in the UK and set up the Military Emissions Gap website. So a quick reminder, maybe some of you don't need reminded but need telling, on why our focus on the military. Firstly, they are huge consumers of fossil fuel, and there are no signs that it's going to change anytime soon, despite energy efficiency initiatives and programs to look into alternative sustainable fuels. For just the US military, analysis of data by Professor Crawford at Brown University shows that between 1998 and 2018, purchases of petroleum fuel by the US military made it the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. Secondly, we know relatively little about the overall impact on global greenhouse gas emissions from all military. This is because there are so many gaps in the data sets. And thirdly, we really know this needs to change. Global and military expenditure reached a record high in 2022, with the United States, China and Russia accounting for 56% of total expenditure. With annual military expenditure increasing to around $2.24 trillion, it is more vital than ever that the military and conflict emissions are addressed within the UNFCCC. So fundamentally, the military emission gap comprises of three key components: what governments are obliged to report to the UNFCCC, what they are reporting on their military emissions, and what is not reported. Unfortunately, because reporting military emissions is voluntary, very few states provide disaggregated data to the UN. The UNFCCC data itself is not very easy to navigate in terms of where the data on the military sits, although some does exist. And even when countries do report their military emissions, there are gaps and the overall data sets are pretty poor. So as I said, in 2021, we set up the Military Emissions Gap website because we realised when trying to review data on the military greenhouse gas emissions, it's not very visible, and sometimes it's difficult to understand where that data sits in the overall UNFCCC reporting web. Also, no one else seemed to be tracking or providing any commentary on military greenhouse gas data from across the globe. We wanted to get a better understanding of what was being submitted by states, and we wanted to see what the data was telling us. The dark shaded countries on here obviously represent Annex 1 countries, and the lighter shade, non-Annex 1 countries, which fall within the world's top 60 in terms of military spenders. So data is requested, as I said, by the UN on military fuel use, but it's pretty difficult to find, as I mentioned earlier. The data sits under energy, under category 1A5, other, not specified elsewhere. And this covers stationary fuel use, so that's like heating, boilers, generators and bases and fixed assets, and mobile fuel use, so that's vehicles, ships and aviation. Military fuel use data, because of the other, this obviously also means that the data can also include other civilian sources, so it's not always certain whether it's military related or civilian related. Military fuel use data can also be reported elsewhere, so sometimes it might be aggregated and found under transport category or other sectors. We don't know also where data from military bunker fuels always sits as well. So looking at the data supplied to the UN, it's not possible to get a clear picture of total military fuel use. With military spending increasing in 2022, this emphasises the need for concerted action to report military emissions and to reduce the related carbon footprint, especially as these emissions are likely to increase in line with military expenditure. Of all Annex 1 countries, only 5 submit disaggregated data last year in line with the UNFCCC obligations. No useful data was provided by Russia, France, Japan, Turkey and Poland, despite them accounting back in 2021 for $200 billion in expenditure. No useful data was provided by non-Annex 1 countries, which includes some of the world's largest military expenditures. So that's China, India, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Brazil, Iran, Israel, who all sit in the top 20 in terms of military expenditure. Based on 2021 data, that's around $550 billion. So what is the overall contribution? And it is given away a bit in our flyer for this event, but an estimate has been made by work led by our colleagues at the Scientists for Global Responsibility, who are also based in the UK. Unfortunately, the estimate, we couldn't use the UNFCCC data because it's just too poor. The estimate was based on active military personnel numbers and stationary emissions. So this is actually, there is some published data in country from energy use on the estate from, say, the UK, Germany and the US. Then a ratio was applied of stationary to mobile emissions depending on the region of the world. So for example, in some countries they may have a greater reliance on Air Force, and in other countries it may be they have higher personnel numbers. Then a multiplier was then used to take into account emissions from the military supply chain. And this gave an estimate of 2,750 million tonnes per year, or 5.5% on average of the global total. And putting this into context, if the military was a country, it would have the 4th highest carbon footprint in the world, and this is higher than Russia. This is just a broad estimate, though, because, of course, this estimate has its limitations. So as I've mentioned, there is some published data on fuel use. That's kind of traditionally Scope 1 side of data sets. There's only limited data on purchased energy, electricity use, Scope 2, and data on emissions from the military supply chain, so that's Scope 3, is very limited. So this 5.5% also only covers day-to-day military activities. It does not include emissions from warfighting activities themselves. It also doesn't include the additional contribution and non-CO2 heating effects from aircraft flying at high altitude, and the contrails or the vapor trails. Militaries, of course, have large and complex supply chains, and we know that emissions from supply chains, Scope 3, typically far exceed an organisation's own emissions. Scope 3 emissions vary, of course, depending on the sector. For example, infrastructure and manufacturing sectors, Scope 3 are estimated to be around about 4 to 7 times higher than an organisation's own emissions. So the 5.5% global estimate that I gave earlier assumed a fairly conservative estimate of a multiplier of 5.8. So the majority of a military's annual greenhouse gas emissions are from its supply chain and not from direct fuel or energy use. So outside of the UN framework, you might be surprised to hear that some countries do actually report their emissions. So this is actually very encouraging. Scopes, though, do vary and typically cover energy use at military bases and fuel use from the operation of military equipment only. The UK MOD, for example, in 2022 started to include Scope 3 emissions. So that was business travel, commuting, waste, service family, accommodation, energy. NATO have also recognised the need for better reporting and have developed a reporting methodology for NATO members. Unfortunately, publication, as far as we know to date, of this has not been forthcoming. So this slide here, we've set out some of our expectations of what could be included. Under Scopes 1, 2 and 3, there's nothing out of the ordinary here at all with respect to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We've added Scope 3 Plus. This includes reporting categories which relate specifically to warfighting activities. These are needed, of course, so that the impacts of a conflict on the climate can be better understood. So the academic research that has been done largely is limited to the focus on the US military. And unfortunately, despite this huge sector, there's been just a handful of academics and NGOs trying to raise a profile. There has been fairly low engagement by the environment sector and external scrutiny into the military and their greenhouse gas emissions, and we encourage others to do more. The IPCC synthesis report published in March only collates the earlier research, so of course it fails to cover military emissions. So what is needed? All sectors must respond to the climate crisis, including the military. Transparency and improvements in reporting and data is critical. Emissions need addressing under the UNFCCC and the Global Stocktake. Be curious and check your government's reporting. And to summarise then, reporting to the UN remains poor. Yet we know that improvements are possible and necessary. This has been proven by the advances by some militaries, including NATO members. We have many big military spenders, however, submitting no useful data, and currently the UNFCCC reporting requires only provision of disaggregated military fuel use data. This, of course, does not account for all of the greenhouse gas emissions from the military. This means that there's huge gaps between the UNFCCC reported data from the military and the actual overall emissions. There are also the emissions from warfighting itself, which you will hear in more detail next. We need to see improvements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linsey. That was such a comprehensive overview. Our next speaker is Lennard de Klerk, who's going to update us on the project that he's initiated to register the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine. Lennard has 25 years of experience in carbon footprinting and carbon mitigation projects across Ukraine and in the Russian Federation. Putting words into action, he's also built a sustainable holiday resort in Hungary, the first and so far only net zero accommodation in Central Europe. A good advert there. Thank you for joining us, Lennard.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and also a warm welcome from me. I'm representing the initiative on GHG Accounting of War, which is a group of experts that convened right after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Russia's act of aggression has and is causing a lot of damage. Damage to human life, damage to the infrastructure, and we've seen the blowing up of Kakhovka hydro dam yesterday, but it's also causing damage to the environment. And whereas, of course, the Ukrainians are the biggest victim, this war impacts all of us. It impacts all of us because this war causes an enormous amount of emissions of greenhouse gases. And while we're here today to try to reduce our emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change, Russia is pushing us in the opposite direction. And we already did a first assessment, which we presented in COP27, which covered the first 7 months of this war. And now we've completed the assessment of the first 12 months of the war, which I'm going to present to you now. So jumping to the conclusions, we estimate that the total emissions of this war is 119 million tons of CO2. And just to put that in perspective, that's almost what a country like Belgium is emitting over a 12-month period. So again, this shows we have so to say a new emitter, which is an equivalent of an heavy industrialized country, a country like Belgium. And going into a little bit of the details, if here I show you a breakdown of the different sources of the different sectors that we've investigated. It's warfare, so these are the military emissions that Linsey has been talking about, but there is much more. It's emissions from wildfires, emissions from refugees fleeing the country. It are emissions from civil aviation, and the biggest chunk is the future emissions for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I'll just go through, and given a limited amount of time, I won't go in too much detail, but just to have a look here at the warfare, at the military emissions. Here you can see the biggest chunk of the emissions are a result of fuel consumption by Russia attacking Ukraine, and fuel consumption by the Ukrainian military defending its territory. And you see it's the biggest chunk. But also not small is the use of ammunition and destroyed military equipment. So we're not talking about direct emissions here, but we're talking about emissions to replenish dwindling ammunition stocks and to replace tanks and other material that has been destroyed. In this report, we also looked into the fortification as Russia is awaiting the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It has constructed a lot of fortifications along the front line, and by using satellite data, we were able to see what kind of fortifications have been built, and this is mainly the so-called dragon teeth, which is made of reinforced concrete. And we try to estimate how much cement and steel Russia has used, although the impact on the emissions is fairly small. Going to fires, compared to the pre-war situation, the amount of fires increased by 36 times. And actually, we were only able to look at fires larger than 1 hectare. So probably this is an underreporting what we're showing here. But translated into carbon emissions, the carbon emissions went up 20 times more. And it's not only because of the shelling and the resulting fires, but also in the areas controlled by the Ukrainian government. Firefighters are often not able to do their work because either they cannot fly or simply the men went to the front to defend their country. So there is also a lot of firefighting activities simply that are put on hold by the circumstances. Going to the future reconstruction of Ukraine, we split it into 3 sectors. Buildings, so you should think about apartment buildings, schools, kindergartens that have either been destroyed or damaged and need to be rebuilt. Transport and infrastructure, so these are roads, railways, but also, for example, cars and trams. And the third element is industry and utilities, and particularly in the utilities, we saw a big increase on damage. Because starting in October, Russia started to attack the Ukrainian infrastructure, basically to put Ukraine in the cold, And as a result, there is a lot of efforts needed to restore the utilities that were destroyed by Russia. But we looked into other topics as well. I already mentioned aviation. Russia closed the airspace to Western airlines, meaning that they cannot use the Siberian airspace to fly from Europe to northern parts of Asia. And just as an example here, a flight from London to Tokyo, which previously took 11 hours, now it's 4 hours longer, meaning there will be more kerosene consumption and hence more emissions. And the total emissions, we've estimated, total additional emissions is 12 million tons. Now we also looked, and the obvious question that there is, well, what happens to the emissions within Ukraine? Because the GDP in 2022 went down almost 30%. So clearly this has led to reduction of emissions within Ukraine as well in the civil society, so to say. However, we did an estimation and came to the conclusion that a lot of, and maybe all of those reductions simply have shifted abroad. It has shifted abroad together with the 8 million refugees that live now in Europe or elsewhere, consuming electricity, heating their homes, consuming products. We've also saw a decrease in production of consumer goods within Ukraine. A lot of it has been substituted by imports, either through regular commercial trade or through humanitarian supply lines. Another big source of emissions is the steel industry in Ukraine. Steel production fell 70% in 2022, but the steel market is a very globalized market. So if Ukraine doesn't export it, someone else will take over this production and hence will take over the emissions. Another sector that we looked into is the European energy sector. Russia's reduction of gas supply triggered an energy crisis, which led to a significant reduction of natural gas consumption within Europe. However, some of that natural gas was substituted by oil. It was mainly the industry that switched from gas to oil. We also saw the power sector switching to coal-fired production. And a third large element was the switching from piped gas to LNG. And LNG has very high upstream emissions. These are emissions to liquefy the gas to LNG and transported it over longer distances. So the net effect was, well, just -2, but given some of the uncertainties, it could also have been +3 million tons. So we simply concluded that the impact on the emissions in Europe that can be attributed to the war is 0. Concluding some of key takeaways, like I said, the emissions as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion are significant and do harm our climate. It simply makes it more difficult to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement to stay below the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Our study also shows is that conflict emissions are more than military emissions alone. In fact, in our study, the military emissions is just 19% of the total. Ukraine is also very eager to after the war is over, after the war has won, to engage on a green recovery. But such a green recovery is only possible if Ukraine has regained full sovereignty over its territory and is also embedded in a European security architecture. We continue with our work. We plan to present an update at COP28. We want to enhance and expand the scope, and particularly we also want to look into military missions outside of Ukraine, so mainly in Europe. We also want to look in how can we reduce the future emissions for the reconstruction of Ukraine. That basically means how can Ukraine be reconstructed with less cement and less steel. And last but not least, we also want to look into the topic of climate damage litigation. Ukraine, together with its partners, wants to hold Russia accountable for the damage it's doing to Ukraine. But we also believe that Russia should be held accountable for the damage it's doing to the climate. So the full report is available now. Here you can see the link where you can download it. And also my contact details. And last but not least, this is also a tribute to Alexei Khabatyuk. Alexei is was a well-known Ukrainian expert in climate and energy. He was one of the first to start working on inventories and also was involved in joint implementation projects under the Kyoto Protocol. When Russia invaded Ukraine, he volunteered and joined the Ukrainian army. But last month he was killed at the Battle of Bakhmut, and he leaves behind a wife and 3 daughters. We'll miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Lennard, for your really important contributions to this topic. I'd also like to take this moment to remind our audience that we will have time at the end for questions. So please do have a think about the questions that you would like to ask our experts while we have them in one place. Moving on, we're pleased to be joined by Axel Michaelowa. Axel has... Go on. Axel has a PhD in economics and has worked on international climate policy instruments and the UNFCCC process since 1994. He is a senior founding partner of Perspectives and a part-time researcher at the Institute of Political Science of the University of Zurich. He specialises on international carbon markets and the design of domestic climate policy instruments, and has written more than 400 research articles and studies on these topics. He's been the lead author on climate policy issues in the 4th and 5th IPCC assessment reports, and has worked on military missions and their accounting since 2000. He's going to use all of this expertise to explore the role that the Global Stocktake has to play in addressing military emissions.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased that we are able to deepen this topic, and as dire as it is, and I thank Lennard for giving the personal touch to it. I think it's important to consider that it's not an abstract thing, it's very personal. So I will now, if I can get the slides up. Good, perfect. Address what is the role of the Global Stocktake here. And we've heard from Linsey already. Well, there is not so much of data available. So I will first get into the role of the Global Stocktake, what is it actually doing, what are we expecting from the COP28 when the Stocktake is to be finished. I will look backwards because the Stocktake, of course, wants to do a historical assessment. What have we achieved in the past couple of years since the Paris Agreement was negotiated and entered into force? And then, of course, also looking forward. What do we want to achieve in the future? And, of course, one of the key aspects of negotiations on the Global Stocktake is what is the balance between looking backwards and looking forward. And then, of course, some recommendations for COP28 out of these observations. So the Global Stocktake is a key component of the Paris Agreement that tries to deal with the bottom-up nature. You know, there are the nationally determined contributions. More than 190 countries who are members of the Paris Agreement all have done these contributions. Some of these contributions have been updated over time and strengthened. Others have not. And of course, now the stocktake shall be the bracket that brings all this together, so that we see what does this structure, this bottom-up structure of the Paris Agreement, achieve on a global level. And of course, we know that we have these reports from, for example, UNEP, the emissions gap report, that the overall emissions gap, which separates us from the 1.5 degree to 2 degree world, remains stubbornly high and has not decreased. So if I was the president of COP28 and could make a decision, I would pull out that report and say that is what we have seen in the past couple of years. So we've tried, but we've not yet been able to close the gap. And of course, looking forward, we want to assess how can we strengthen the NDCs? How can we strengthen mitigation overall? How can we ensure that the funding is coming along? And of course, all these topics are negotiated not only under the Global Stocktake, but also in the other negotiation streams. So essentially, the Global Stocktake brings together all the other negotiation streams. And now, of course, the question is, will we, let's say, get a bang out of the Global Stocktake, or will we get a whimper? Because, yeah, there may well be the possibility that there will be some report, and that is then the Global Stocktake. And we've seen it in the past. We've seen, for example, the demonstrable progress under the Kyoto Protocol. Only very few people remember what it meant. It fizzled out. So we need to prevent that the Global Stocktake fizzles out here. And of course, many civil society research organizations have provided their input. If you look at the Global Stocktake website, under the UNFCCC website, you'll find more than 1,000 submissions. So there's a lot of material. The question is, what will be done by the nations that are assembled here and that will be assembled at COP28 in Dubai? Now, looking backwards, what is the role of the military missions? And of course, Linsey has given us a clear indication. Lennard has given us a superb example of a concrete assessment of a concrete case, and both that shows the emissions are relevant. But we need to say that we have only a very rough understanding. Again, as Linsey said, data are very few, they are hidden, some of them may not be robust. So, yeah. So if we would now say, under a fair contribution to the Global Stocktake, what is the contribution of military emissions to the problem? What is the contribution of conflict-related emissions to the problem? We can give some indications, but we cannot give very robust statements, at least not comparable with other sources of the same magnitude. Look what has been discussed on the global aviation emissions, at global shipping emissions. We have here the same magnitude, and still, well, there is a bunch of researchers, maybe 50 researchers around the world that have tried to enlighten us. Nita Crawford, for example, with her study on the US military, Stuart Parkinson with his studies. I've tried to pull together some of the estimates in the report I did last year for an NGO whose founder is sitting next to me. So what we can say, about 3 to 6% of global emissions come from military, come from conflicts. But yeah, that's a range which is unacceptably high, and that needs to be remedied. And also, of course, as Lennard has shown, there are categories of emissions that have not really been addressed to date. For example, if we look into the conflict-related emissions, there are few estimates also of past conflicts. They differ by large amounts, and actually no one was interested. It's really strange how the conflict on Ukraine has generated a debate on this topic. 20 years ago, I wrote my first paper on military and conflict-related emissions. It was a good journal, but nobody cared. Now at least some people care, media care. So let's use this opportunity. Looking forward, what can we do? An important aspect of what we can do is to improve accounting, to make sure that this voluntary nature, some countries reporting a bit on fuel-related emissions, that it is strengthened, that the various sources of emissions that have been described very nicely by Lennard, by Linsey, that these will figure in the national accounts, and that the national greenhouse gas inventory guidelines of the IPCC actually take this into account. And what is very important, and what I found really as an important outcome of the side event we had last year in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, the discussion about emissions from occupied territory. And I found it fascinating how the government of Moldova, government of Georgia, and of course also government of Ukraine showcased we still want to report these emissions. And before the side event, I had not fully understood how important this is for the sovereignty of these countries. But there may be other countries who say, look, why should we be held accountable for emissions of a territory we can't do policies on? So maybe some other governments would say that should now be the responsibility of the aggressor who's taken away our land. Of course, it doesn't mean that we give up our sovereignty. So we should have an opportunity that governments decide clearly we want to continue, or we shift the responsibility for these emissions to the occupier. And then, of course, also now the question, what can COP28 do? And COP28 is held in a region which has seen many conflicts. Actually, in that region, we had one of the instances of the highest emissions of a military conflict. The oil fires in Kuwait, Iraq invading, putting fire to the oil fields, burning about 400 million tons of CO2. One of the biggest emissions pulse. So, well, Ukrainian war emissions are high, but don't yet get into this order of magnitude. So the region has suffered from that in the past. So I would hope that the presidency of COP28 understands how important this is, takes it up, gives it its rightful place in the global stocktake. But of course, for this to happen, we need pressure. We need pressure by researchers, we need pressure by NGOs, we need pressure by the media. It will not fall from the sky. So let's not drown in the voices. I've taken a beautiful picture from a past global stocktake. There are so many aspects of the global stocktake. Let's see how this important aspect is integrated in the global stocktake, both backwards looking, both forward looking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel. And for our last speaker, as Axel has alluded to, I'm pleased to introduce Deborah Burton, co-founder of Tipping Point North-South and the lead on its main advocacy project, Transform Defence for Sustainable Human Security. And she's joining us today to discuss civil society's role in tackling military and conflict emissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. It's actually human safety. We feel that security is a somewhat inadequate term to kind of wrap our heads around when we're thinking about where we're going as we move towards possibly 2 degrees. So thanks. Yeah, I want to speak to the civil society perspective on this issue. As the UNFCCC describes it, the global stocktake means looking at everything related to where the world stands on climate action and support, identifying the gaps, and working together to agree on solutions pathways. So I have to say it's with some relief, in a way, that researchers and civil society together are finally getting this military emissions data gap onto the radar of the media, policymakers, and critically onto the UNFCCC agenda. As we are surely overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius, every single contribution to mitigation matters, which is why we need urgent action on the transparency and accountability of military emissions, counting and reporting, leading in turn to significant emissions reduction and ultimately decarbonisation. However, this assumes that decarbonisation is possible for such an intensively fossil fuel reliant sector. And this is a dimension to the story we're not here to talk about today. But suffice to say, so far, the research seems to indicate that the jury is out on whether this is even remotely possible. The brand new F-35 being bought up all over the world and planned to keep flying until 2070, it's a new endeavour, drinks around 6,000 litres of jet fuel per flying hour. So what we do know, as Linsey has said, is that military emissions is estimated to be, on patchy data, 5.5% of global emissions. That figure does not include conflict-related emissions. And there has not been a year in modern history that the world has remained conflict-free. And Ukraine, indeed, is the first country to attempt to assess climate impact of conflict. And you've heard from Lennard. But what of previous wars, recent wars? Professor Nita Crawford has estimated emissions by the US military during the war-intensive period 2001 to 2018, estimated that to be at 1.3 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Of that, war-related activities in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Syria accounted for 440 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So as Axel mentioned, at COP27 in Egypt, the first official side event to address military emissions was hosted by Ukraine and the UK NGO CAFOD. The event was titled Dealing with Military and Conflict-Related Emissions under the UNFCCC. And it did secure widespread media coverage, and that was very gratifying. Our calls for action on military emissions reporting was presented, drawn from our Perspectives report that Axel was lead author on. And those calls included, ambitious calls included, an IPCC special report into the role of the global military in climate change, and for military and conflict-related emissions to be included in the Global Stocktake. We subsequently went on and made our submission to the Global Stocktake on behalf of 8 organisations: CEOBS, Concrete Impacts, the Costs of War Project in the US, Norwegian People's Aid, Scientists for Global Responsibility, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, ZOI Environment Network, and ourselves at Tipping Point North-South. And that submission had 5 key messages. Reporting disaggregated military fuel use data to the UNFCCC is voluntary and inconsistent across states, as you've heard. Data gaps on military and conflict emissions compromise the Global Stocktake 2023 assessment and the understanding of where these contributions sit. Effective reporting of military emissions through UNFCCC processes would help ensure IPCC modelling of temperature rises are more accurate. Number 4, with global military expenditure at around it's $2.2 trillion at the moment each year and rising, military emissions are also very likely to increase. And finally, military and conflict-related emissions must be better addressed within the UNFCCC framework, and you've had incredible detail on that from the speakers. So for me, it's the 4th key message I want to take a little bit of time on next. because many of the researchers and campaigners around the world who work on this issue, ourselves included, understand that the emissions story is inextricably linked to another, and that is runaway military spending. There is a positive correlation between military spending and military greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, more military spending simply leads to more emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3. Between 2013 and 2021, global military spending increased 21%, exceeding $2 trillion per year. And that was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that now the US, the European Union, and Russia are all significantly increasing their military spending. From production to deployment, high levels of military spending are necessary to underwrite and maintain the big-ticket fossil fuel-intensive hardware, such as the jets, warships, tanks, bombs, and missiles. And so it is that the G20 nations account for the bulk of global military spending at 87%. And 7 of the top 10 historical emitters are also amongst the top 10 global military spenders: US, China, Russia, the UK, France, Japan, and Germany. There are rather 2 depressing numbers that indicate where the big military spending and emitting countries put their priorities. For example, in 2020, rich countries spent 6 times more on their militaries than on public climate finance. And Annex II countries spent 30 times more on their militaries than climate finance. Between 2013 and 2021, the most polluting nations spent just shy of $9.5 trillion on their militaries, and they spent $243 billion on climate finance for the world's most vulnerable nations. As we head towards COP28 and the Global Stocktake's almost certain conclusion that we will breach 1.5 degrees in the coming 3 to 4 years, are we left to conclude that climate goals are being put second to military objectives? Because it would seem so. And if military spending positively correlates to military emissions, then surely these ever-rising levels of military spending in a climate emergency are utterly incompatible with climate targets. We count emissions in order to know the full challenge. We count in order to cut and hopefully get humanity to a better place. But that better place is not about economy alone. It is about a progressive transformation of foreign and defense policy through the lens of our climate emergency. So to conclude, at 5.5% of global emissions, at least, the big fossil fuel-reliant militaries and their associated defense industries have a significant part to play in reduction and mitigation. The question is how, and how rapidly. By including them, the first and subsequent global stocktakes will be making an invaluable contribution to achieving full accountability on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Deborah. Now, before we open the floor to you, our audience, we're first going to hear from the deputy head of the Ukrainian delegation. I believe some friendly volunteers may have roaming microphones to help us with this. If we could possibly have that microphone up here at the front, please. Thank you. Just over here.
I will be brief because the main effective person here is the expert who conveys the real truth, objective figures and facts. Russian propaganda has been lying to the world community for decades. And if you believe Russian propaganda, then after the information troops, the Russian army will knock to your door and attack you. We can resist this informational and armed aggression on the basis on honest expert data on the impact of direct military actions and secondary consequences on life and on the environment and climate. I am sincerely grateful. My thanks grateful to Lennard and all experts who did a very important job and collected such important information, figures, facts, and made an analysis on the consequences of armed aggression. I really hope that this report will be included in the indictment against the Moscow regime at the Hague Tribunal. Ukraine is one of the most peaceful countries in the world. Ukraine is fighting against the destruction of Ukrainian and the killing of Ukrainian people, children, animals, forest, and the environment. This is a war of survival against Russian terrorists. And such reports show that such a terrible war is not only a problem of Ukraine. The consequences of Russian armed aggression go beyond the borders of Ukraine. Therefore, the joint actions of all the countries of the world must stop the Russian aggression and soon as possible condemn the Moscow regime. Once again, and sincerely thank the international experts and hope that your report will be definitely be presented on COP28. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll now open up the floor to any audience members who have any questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, and then our lovely volunteer will come. If not, oh, there's one over there.
Hi, hello. Thank you for a great presentation and about such a horrible topic. My question is to the experts. Especially to the last expert talking. So you were referring to military emissions, and Lennard was making a difference between military-related emissions and conflict-related emissions. And as I understood from the presentation, conflict-related emissions are much, much higher than military-related emissions. So for me, I think there should be a sense to focus on conflict-related emissions when we're addressing negotiators and negotiations rather than military-related emissions, because conflict-related emissions are much higher, and such regimes, as our deputy head of delegation said, such regimes as Moscow regime, they will not probably listen to any demands towards reducing military-related emissions, and we should focus on conflict-related emissions to stop the conflicts. And military, it should exist because such regimes as Moscow, they still exist, and there is a constant threat out of them. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think, Lennard, would you like to respond to that first?
Yeah, when I mentioned, the share of military emissions within the current, within the war of Ukraine is relatively small. But it doesn't mean that military emissions as such are small, because most of the military emissions, thank God, are when there is peacetime. So this 5.5% that was shown is mainly military emissions during peace. So when they're training, they have their operations. They're doing trainings and so far. So let's say the conclusion should not be that we basically should ignore military emissions and only focus on conflict emissions. But I think our message here is, we should work on both, because both are significant and both have to reduce significantly. Military missions are not easy to tackle for various reasons. Of course, the conflict emissions would be much easier if Russia wants this war to stop. The conflict emissions will stop the same moment.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very relevant question. Actually, as has been described, of course, the basic military emissions have been addressed at least partially. What has not been addressed at all are the conflict-related emissions and allocating the responsibility for those. And as noted, the emission peaks from conflicts can be massive. So it's a bit comparing, for example, the context of forest, what are the emissions related to forestry and what are the emissions if a forest burns down completely. So I would think that in the context of the stocktake, there should be a clear differentiation between the conflict-related and the military emissions. It should be made very clear that, of course, cumulatively, the military emissions may have the same order of magnitude as conflict-related emissions, because fortunately conflicts are not pervasive, but that, of course, in order to ensure that there is an incentive to reduce conflicts, the responsibility for the conflict-related emissions needs to be very openly addressed.
Thank you. Any other questions? There's the gentleman in the blue shirt.
My name's David Hill, I'm Stamp Out Poverty in the UK. Thank you so much for all of these really powerful presentations. And I think, to me, what's come over most of all is how little is understood about the military use of fossil fuels being a major contributor to the climate emergency, and that isn't well known. And it needs to be conveyed. And I do wonder, and I'd like to ask your opinions on this, whether you need to obsess on the data gap. Because my experience of campaigns is that, for instance, on the tax justice campaign, we didn't know all the figures. We didn't know exactly how much was being hidden, because it was being hidden, it was being evaded. You couldn't see these numbers. But once you establish, if you want to establish that this is a problem, you state a volume to do with ranges for what you can best get information for, but mainly to establish that quantum is huge and therefore a major contribution to the problem. So I would just ask, because so much was, to do with data, whether you feel that in fact strategically to move the main point of this campaign or this forward, you need to be so obsessed on just getting exactly the right numbers.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. Would any of our panelists like to, I think, Deborah and then Linsey?
Okay.
And I think, and Dave knows this, I come from the trade and tax justice campaigns. So you're absolutely right. There comes a point at which you leap off because you know the direction you're heading in. And I feel that with this, the peace movement itself, they are fully on. I mean, the peace movement understand it. And Linsey mentioned, it's tough to get significant players from the environmental movement to step up. Although Greenpeace absolutely have. Greenpeace Europe are absolutely on this issue. So I think we're probably at that point where we are, I feel like we've made a quantum leap. I think we probably all feel like there's been a quantum leap in the past sort of 12 to 18 months on this, certainly since COP. Just in terms of getting, serious players engaging with the fact that they don't know. So as that trickles down in terms of a kind of a campaign constituency, I think you're absolutely right. What needs to be done is to take the policy, the research, the policy, move that into advocacy and proper campaigning, and decide what that looks like. But I think, I don't know, I think it's probably, that's why we kind of concentrate on the money. I think for us at Tipping Point, it is actually all about the money, as it is with almost everything to do with the climate emergency and vested interests. And who are those tough vested interests to shift? I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, good question. But I would say that I think data is really powerful because it informs. And we've been kind of, to begin with, a bit of part of a guessing game. You know, you raise a question and you raise this as an issue, and the first question is, well, how big a contribution is it? Can't be much, can it? Because we don't really know much about, it's not really raised. So you need that data to inform those that can make, those policymakers, and also to inform the public and general awareness that this is actually an issue which needs carbon accounting associated with it and targets associated with it. As I mentioned, no sector can be exempt from this, and the military and the government's militaries needs to be part of that solution as well. And also because to inform the IPCC, we need the research. They need research, they need physical data and evidence to support what we want to happen.
Any further questions on, there's one in the back over there.
Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, hi. Sorry, I have a question, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on military emissions accounting for military forces that are stationed externally in other countries' jurisdictions, such as the U.S. military force in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I can see Axel nodding and scribbling, so that suggests Axel might take this question.
Well, this, of course, is a crucial aspect of allocation. So ideally, there would be an agreement between the country where the base is located and the army that uses the base about the accounting of the emissions. Of course, in the past, this has not been done. But now it would be time, as, for example, the agreements are updated, to then consider, well, I know the Okinawa in Japan is dominated by US bases, so I would expect that probably 2/3 of the emissions from Okinawa are from those bases. So it can be really significant, and I would think that campaigns by NGOs based in these areas could lead to more transparency. Of course, the governments may be reluctant to address it head-on, but yeah, it is significant, and it would be very important to have a clear agreement how to report those.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Useful, I think, to look at the way that this can work in sort of specific case studies like that. Any other questions from our audience? No, well, if not, I wondered whether, Linsey, you mentioned before about the gaps in the IPCC reporting because of the catch-up of research. And I wondered if there's something, if you had a call to any academics in the room, or what is it that research and academia could do to support a campaign like this?
Well, that's, as I mentioned in the presentation, really, there's just been a relatively handful of NGOs, academics covering this. Peace movement have, as Deborah mentioned, got on board with this, but, why is this gap? Why haven't climate organisations, why haven't wider environmental organisations taken this on board as a topic? And I think that's probably a history from the military, from other aspects with respect to their environmental impacts, has been largely ignored. The environment is seen, we know from a long time, it's seen as the collateral damage of warfare, and environmental aspects are not necessarily considered. So, the wider issues have been ignored by environmental sectors, not all, of course, but predominantly. So it's encouraging others to do exactly this. To, as I said in the presentation, check what your government's doing. Are they reporting? What military climate strategies has your government? Some governments do have them. They've got climate strategies out there. They've got energy strategies. How good are those strategies? Are they just covering and looking at climate security aspects, or how the military must adapt to climate change? Or are they actually considering how they themselves need to reduce their carbon emissions and mitigate? So you need to ask of your governments what they're doing. You need to look and review critically their climate strategies in that context, and then look at the reporting and what they're covering. So there's a lot we can all do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And if there's no further questions, one last one in the back then.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I just have a question. There were lots of data about GHG gases emissions and CO2, but USA and UK, they have lots of warships and submarines which use nuclear fuels. I would like to know if there are any data about nuclear waste produced by these ships. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Would any of our speakers like to take up that one? I think the question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, about any data on nuclear waste produced by warships. Is that correct? And submarines. I think Linsey might take this.
I can't answer it fully, I'm afraid. No, it's not something that we've specifically been looking at for this. In the UK, I don't think they've decommissioned any of their nuclear submarines yet. Again, colleagues at Scientists for Global Responsibility has been looking to some extent in this. But yeah, it's a good question, but not something particularly we've addressed here.
As our time comes to a close, suddenly we have a lot of hands. So I think let's go to, I think possibly already asked a question. So actually we'll go to the gentleman next to you, and then the gentleman behind, and then if we have time, we'll return to you.
Thank you so much, and a wonderful presentation. I didn't hear from any speakers, of course, relating the applicability of the data to the African context, whereby even the expenditures on the military equipment is not questionable in our countries. So how do we engage in such circumstances where the military can even take you to question, to account, especially in the government emissions related to military?
I'm having to remember from memory, and I don't think any of the African states fall within the top 60 military spenders. So when we were looking at the data sets, to be honest, I don't think we focused on any African countries. So I can't directly answer that. But again, it's as part of that call from civil society to, and I know it will be extremely difficult in some states to ask those questions, to begin those conversations of where the military sits and how they're addressing some of these issues.
And then the question to the gentleman behind.
Thank you for the possibility. I would like to make a little detour because the nuclear was mentioned, and many people might be aware of the pressure and intense lobbying of the nuclear industry being a solution to the climate crisis. There was a report last year that came out by Al Jazeera about missile strikes on nuclear, so-called civil nuclear power plants in the region of the Near East, and now we have exactly this situation in the Ukraine. And first, I also wanted to ask to Lennard, especially because the dam is now damaged, and now it's a southern dam, so the water is shrinking every hour. We have less water to cool the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest one in Europe. If they would have blown up the northern dam, we would have had a flooded nuclear power plant, and these conflicts, they will somehow increase in connection with the climate crisis. And so our opinion on that is that nuclear can absolutely no solution to the climate crisis. And maybe you can mention about the situation in the water and the dam in Zaporizhzhia. Are you busy with that in the Ukraine? That would be my question to Lennard. Thank you.
Well, if I would have been busy with it, I wouldn't be here. But what I understand is, indeed, cooling water comes from that lake, but they do have a separate pond of cooling water, which they can use if the river cannot supply enough cooling water. So it's expected that in a couple of days, when the level is going down significantly, they will start using this cooling pond, which at least can, cool all 6 reactors for the coming months. So that's at least what I know, but I'm simply here. I'm not an expert on these issues. It simply shows how irresponsible Russia is, and with no respect for whatsoever, starting with human life, but also being so irresponsible in putting so many lives at risk.
Just one last word, because even the International Atomic Energy Agency, as in person, Mr. Grossi, we are sailing in unknown waters. That was his statement on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm afraid we are running out of questions. I'm sorry. But just to add on to about the fact of the limited information at the moment about the dam, I know that the Conflict Environment Observatory, me and Linsey are representing on Twitter as Detox Conflict, are following that, and there's quite a comprehensive thread analysing the situation over there. So that might be worth a look. So as our session is coming to an end, I want to invite each of our speakers just to share some short now closing remarks, just reflecting on the conversation so far and the questions that have been raised. So speakers, if you could keep to maybe a minute or so of just a quick reflection, and we'll start from Linsey.
Really, just to repeat what I've been saying all along, really is about look to see what your government's doing. If there are any climate military strategies out there, please do look at them, interrogate them, and any reporting, and start asking those, I know they're difficult, questions. Thank you.
Well, I would like to conclude also with a positive message. Ukraine is very much committed to recover its country in a green way. And it maybe not so much from climate concerns, but they've realized that a renewable energy system, a decentralized energy system, it's much safer than a centralized one. Basically, this war also has accelerated the transition to renewable energy within Europe. So that's a positive sign. So it's good to have Ukraine on board on this as well, but this can only happen if Ukraine gets full control over its territory and is embedded in a European security system. Thank you.
Yeah, lobby with the COP28 presidency to get the rightful place of the military and conflict-related emissions in the global stocktake, both backward-looking, showing the gaps about the information, and forward-looking, remedying the gaps in the future.
I mean, I want to be a bit like Lennard and sort of end on a bit of a hopeful note, because as I said earlier, there has been a huge leap in media policy and public awareness on this in a relatively short space of time. And I think it will increasingly become harder for governments to turn that convenient blind eye on military emissions, sweep it under the carpet, because they know eyes are on them. Eyes are on them, and I have every hope that military emissions will make it into the global stocktake. And I just want to extend a thank you to everybody who has come to this session, because it is still very early days, and it's a terrible truth that we are here because of an invasion. because of the Russian invasion, and we have war in Europe. So what can I say? It didn't happen for Iraq or Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, all of these ongoing conflicts. So we are here, and thank you for your support and interest, and we move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to conclude, I'd really like to thank our experts for their time, for the audience in the room and online who've been able to join us. I'd also like to thank all the organisations who aren't present on this panel but who have supported this event, which includes ZOI Environment Network, Green Wave, Ecoaction and Concrete Impacts. If you're interested in the wider issue around militarisation, you may want to stick around for the next side event. And also there is a sign-in sheet right here on the desk if you'd like to keep up to date with our work. Thank you very much.